Edge of Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion occasionally dealing with mature topics.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, after a pause that was way too long for my liking, Edge of Chaos is back. I'm Neurotoxin, and today we get to talk about absolutely everyone's favorite topic, especially Joe's here, food.
Food in America.
Food in America, which is kind of a strong term, isn't it? Food.
McDonald's will be
of
coming
crap
up,
we
probably.
eat, right? Exactly. And before we go any further, we have with us today a very special guest, a relatively new fan of our show who impressed me with his knowledge and his research on this topic. His name is Ben Schnittger. And introduce yourself, Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from the D.C. area. I've done quite a bit of study into the topic of nutrition and nutritional politics. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I do have very strong opinions about the thing. So if that's what we're going to be doing today, I guess.
Well, some of the so-called experts on this topic in this country, some of the people consider experts, like Alex Jones.
Oh, well.
The guys from Naturals.
You can take one look at him and tell he knows a lot of food.
Food, right, exactly.
I don't know if he knows certain kinds all that well, like lettuce or spinach, but anyway.
Right. So when I first started talking to Ben, or Ben started talking to me, I was very impressed with his knowledge and just with the sources he was falling back on and the arguments he was making just in terms of empiricism. And anyone that knows me, anyone that's seen me debate knows how much of just a nutbuster I am with that and how I will break through people and show them just how inaccurate their sources are and just how they don't know what they're talking about. And I was thoroughly impressed with Ben. Everything he was saying makes sense. It was rational. It was balanced. It was actually founded in objectivism, which is what I like to see. So with no further ado, Ben, I guess you had kind of an introduction to the topic, and you wanted to give us some ideas and some sources and some notes on the terms and just the history of agricultural policy in this country. So take it away.
Well, first off, let's talk about nutrition for a second. I look at nutrition and I see the basic building blocks for how we live our lives. For instance, if you're not getting the nutrition you need, your brain doesn't function properly, and you can't make good decisions. That's the very most basic element of nutrition that I'd like to talk about first off. And so what I'd like to say is first, nutrition is the science that interprets the interaction of nutrients, which is the chemistry that makes up your body and your life. And if you take that in context and you look at the bigger picture, you get what I like to call nutritional politics, right? Which is where you've got a certain intake in calories, you've got a certain intake in nutrition and trace elements that are vital to the functioning of the body, without which you've got a society that basically gets thrown into chaos and nobody knows why. For instance, if you look at the witch burnings, you look at back then they had massive chaos in society because of the fact that the wheat that they were eating was poisoned, and to think of an entire era or part of American history being caused by poisoned food, it's not something that we do a lot, but that's the politics of nutrition right there, you know?
Really? So how was it poisoned? You say it was poisoned. Can you be more specific?
It was actually a fungus that is the building block of LSD that caused these people to start freaking out because their wheat was poisoned with it. It was infected with this fungus. And strangely enough, it also happened in France, and that's where we basically started looking at this whole situation differently. Now, if you're going to take that in context to today, you've got to look at what we're eating, how it's nourishing our bodies, and if it's not doing that, what is the result? What's going to end up happening because of it? And I look at things like the subsidies in corn and the subsidies in wheat and all these other grains that really don't have the nutritional basis that humans as hunter-gatherers had, that caused our brains to grow to such a degree that we created these things. We're only going to regress if we can't get to a point where we can recognize
what was it? Who was the comedian that said, if this is political evolution, Well,
in
Joe,
8 years we'll be voting for plants. That was Lewis Black.
I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at it from you're talking about an evolutionary perspective here, Ben, and you're talking about growth and development of brain. I mean, if you look at our politicians and the guys who get elected, and I mean, I look at this every day and I think this is democracy. This is who the people voted for. These guys really. It's not even partisanship or even their takes. It's just the sheer stupidity. It's just like, really, you said that? You were elected to office?
It makes you wonder what is going on, and
really,
maybe that's the what, right?
I think maybe you have the answer here, Ben.
Well,
So
it was almost 20 years ago. Carlin was saying in '96, he's like, okay, well, if these guys all are suck, where did they come from? They don't pass through a membrane from another reality. This is the best we can do. Garbage in, garbage out. So maybe there's something to that.
Here's the real paradox that I see when it comes to nutrition. If you are looking at a guy and thinking, I want to vote for that guy, but the reason you do that is because you're not getting the proper brain nutrients, then you'll never know how to get those proper brain nutrients because you can never make a good decision. And it's basically a downward spiral from there. I think that's one of the main aspects of our society that we haven't examined yet. The McDonald's and the crap that we shove into our bodies is just causing us to get dumber. I think at a fundamental level, once you get to the point where you can see that, then it's time to start making changes, at least in yourself, you know?
Okay.
I want to throw a monkey wrench into this to make this political right off the bat just for fun. This has popped in my head. Isn't it interesting how a lot of Americans have been so negative towards, and this is a two-layered statement, I guess, because this goes in two directions, how Obama got made so much fun of for eating healthy. The Mr. He puts arugula on a sandwich crap that came out in '08. You remember that?
No,
I thought that was one of the weakest attacks on him. It's like, really, you can't do better than, he eats lettuce on his hamburger. What a freak.
Really? That makes a freak now?
And here's the thing, we could debate the school lunch thing with Michelle Obama later, but the fact that everyone was making fun of her putting in a White House garden, I mean, come on, really? It's almost like if Obama came out in favor of sunny days, Republicans would be like, well, why is he trying to deny us the freedom to have rain once in a while?
Right, exactly.
It's that crazy now. So, I mean, do you see some of that maybe dumbness in that attack? I mean, attack Obama over worthwhile things, not, he eats arugula. Seriously? It wouldn't hurt you to eat arugula, too, sometimes, you fat ass. I knew I should eat it more than I do.
There you go, yeah.
At a certain point, I think Americans take pride in the crap that we eat.
Completely.
Look at hot dogs. There's nothing to take pride in there. That's just all the leftovers from the rest of it, and yet we look at that as our traditional American hot dog, football, and baseball cuisine,
I think it's worse. I think we look at it as party food. That's fun food.
I'm having fun. Actually, so here's the thing. I want to fess up right away in this discussion. I am a person who's raised, reared, and educated in this exact environment. I am American to the core, and I have a fatal attraction to the worst kinds of food. And that's exactly I take responsibility for that as an adult that makes horrible choices right now, but that's what I know. That's what I was brought up in. So it's so common and it's so easy. And then it's that much more difficult to break out of and to learn those better habits.
Well, there's definitely the sociological factor and the kind of the family cultural factor, and we'll get into that. But I kind of really wanted to let Ben talk a little bit more about kind of the direction he was going with policy. And so please go on.
Well, let's go to those bad decisions for a second. I think too many people look at their eating habits and think, I have to stop this. Well, why don't you add some more healthy things instead of stopping the things that you've got? Like, for instance, the whole school lunch program, it stopped the things that people liked instead of adding more options and saying, here, instead of this, why don't you try this? Or in addition to this, eat some, like you were saying, arugula. Eat some kale. Eat something with the rest of it instead of taking away. Because again, we've got habits, and those habits are a hard thing to break. But adding to it instead of taking away from it is really the answer. Because people have to find their own taste and have to form new habits. You can't just say, all right, I'm done with all fatty foods tomorrow, because your body doesn't work like that, and I guarantee you, you're not going to keep up with it.
I
Now,
can say from experience that's true.
I mean, yeah, like I said,
And I've lasted a week, I've lasted a month doing that, and then after a while you're like, I need a damn cheeseburger, and there you go.
Yep.
I mean, I can tell you as a social worker, as someone that's dealt with addictive behavior from many different perspectives with clients, that, yeah, that does not work. The cold turkey thing is very, very difficult for people. Anyone can stop, but for someone to stay
Especially not
stopped,
with food you deal with every day. You
Yes.
can't just not go to a bar like you do with booze.
Right, there's a
or
lot
not
of
go to
things-
the drug corner when you do with drugs. Yeah,
there's
it's
a lot
impossible.
of strategies that are useful for kind of some addictions that really don't work with like
They all
poor
fail
food choices.
with food.
So go
Anyway.
on, Ben.
That's part of the issue right there. Is we've got mentalities in this country that have caused us to go back into these cycles. You know, the cyclical mentality is what rules the country as far as our perception of reality. For instance, every 4 years we've got to go back into the mentality that we have to elect another strong leader that's going to lead us out of the situation. Every time we start a diet, we have to think that we're going to stop everything else. It doesn't work that way. That's not how societies evolve. That's not how people change. The idea behind making nutritional changes, especially with your family and yourself, is to introduce more things. It's not taking away options as much as it is adding to it. Because if it works, the success will be obvious. That's what's going to make you want to achieve more. That's where I come from when it comes to nutrition. We have to look at what works and build from it instead of taking away the things that we like.
Do you think that a major problem is that I don't know why it is that nutrition, more than a lot of issues, there's so many self-appointed experts and hucksters and Dr. Oz types, and to branch it out into overall health, you got these like, oh, you just take this pill and then you can eat whatever you want, or eat all meat, or eat all veg, or go vegan, go vegetable. I mean, there's so many like just sort of self-appointed experts and things that are dubiously based, and it's promoted as if you do this and only this and you never deviate from it, and that's it. It almost seems like not a religion, but sort of just an ethos you have to adopt completely or bust, you know. And that's maybe it leaves a lot of people drifting and kind of not sure what choices to make if they weren't given a good background. Like
it
some people I
absolutely
know.
is. And I think that is the result of not having a strong individualistic mentality. I think we start out in the factory schools, eating factory grown food, thinking in a factory way, and then once we read something, we apply it to ourselves in such a way that we don't see any other options, any other of the prior aspects of ourselves in that process. So we start subtracting, and we start making little boxes that we have to fit ourselves into, because that's our mentality growing up. That's how we see, what we eat and everything else. We have to get out of the factory mentality before good decisions can start being made, because we are individuals. We can make our choices, but if we're not looking at things individually and what works for us and what doesn't, we're going to end up going back into these cycles.
Well, I can lecture for days on bureaucracy, which is my term for just standardization and bureaucratic organization from a sociological perspective. I've written a number of papers on it, a number of articles, so we can certainly get into that. But what I would like for us to talk about a little bit instead is kind of food policy, and you were kind of going there, and then we tend to deviate and we'll go around the topic for a while. But you were starting to talk about grain and the importance of grain, particularly corn, in this country. And I mean, I am very familiar with the history of subsidies and the history of the policy, but I'm not too familiar with the specifics of what is subsidized in chemical and biological terms and just what goes into our diet. So you were kind of talking about that a little bit, Ben, and I'd like for you to keep talking about that. I'd like for you to educate our listeners on that.
Okay, well, let's go back to the history of corn in the beginning. When corn first started out, it was little more than a couple of grains on a tiny piece of a cob. If you go back into the Mesoamerican era, you find that the first grains of corn were tiny, and they were bred to be big and fat and juicy simply because it was great filler for the animals. It was great filler for other things. It didn't really give a whole lot of nutrition, but it filled you up quickly. It's a lot like rice.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. When historically would you say this was going on, the breeding it to be larger?
Well, the domestication of corn was about 7 to hold on. It was more around 4,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. I think
wow.
it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was right after they got into the region. That's one of the staples that they grew. And if you look at their mythology, you find all these stories about Corn Man, which was a man that basically grew up out of the ground, and he was the precursor to humankind. And that is sort of how they saw the corn. The corn was life because there was very little of nutritional value. They didn't have large animals. They didn't have big game. So what they had to do was they had to grow all of what they needed for society. And that's why they identified with it. That's why they saw themselves in the corn. Now, bringing that up to the present, you look at the breadbasket of America. You look at the traditions that we have around corn and how we feed it to all of our animals and all the rest of the stuff. The reason we do it is because it makes great filler. It makes things fat. And that's why we subsidize it, is because we know that it works to make things fat. It works better than grass. It works better than, natural grazing, because we want that fat and we want that quick. That's what it comes down to as to why we subsidize it. Now, in the amount that we do is completely ridiculous. They would subsidize something like corn and just throw it away, simply to say that we're doing something for all these farmers. That's their selling point. I think that's the main issue of why they subsidize and why it's such a staple in our society, is because they could say they're doing something.
I think it's amazing. I think your average American doesn't realize how many things corn is involved in. It's the sugar that's a lot of the horrible snacks and sodas have in it, high fructose corn syrup, and it's in all our gas and ethanol. So it's ubiquitous. Corn is like everywhere, literally in America.
It's just
when
literally...
you eat, when you fill your car up, when you drink a beverage a juice or anything, it's there. It's everywhere. Yeah, so you're right. And it's funny. I saw one. I think it was just an internet picture. One of those internet pictures, but it was showing the different corns from antiquity into now, and like in the last few hundred years in America, the cobs have gone from like these little things that the Native Americans were growing to these giant, huge corn ears that we have now. It's crazy.
I wonder if you could draw like a correlation, like a little direct, one of those like graphs of like the weight of the average American on one side.
Stop
and
looking
like
at
the size of looking at myself, and like the size of the average corn cob on the other. Because I think what Ben is saying is completely on target. It's what a lot of nutritionists call empty calories.
Completely.
And what I kind of want to get into a little bit is subsidy policies, and this is something my area of research in political science and international relations in my undergrad. A lot of it was immigration policy, which is very, very closely tied to agricultural subsidies. And we've done a couple of shows on immigration. We've always talked about that. We want to get into the agricultural policy and how it affects it. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about this, Ben, because I think you're going to know the specifics better than I do. But actually, I guess my first question to you would be, when did the subsidies, and specifically ones around corn, when did this really become a thing? Because what I feel like, to go with what Joe is saying, is when we have a new food, when we have something new developed, like, for example, soda pop was something that was developed around the late 19th century and
early 20th,
late 19th, early 20th, depending on what you consider soda pop. And at that point, it had real sugar. It had cane sugar. Now, not saying it was good for you, but it was considered a dessert thing. It was expensive. Mm-hmm. And it was something that, like, you'd go out with your family and you buy.
You couldn't
for
just buy it in bottles.
For
one, you'd have to buy it at a soda fountain, made fresh.
Right.
Anyway.
And when we cornified it, when we switched to corn syrup, is when it kind of became a mainstream thing, and you could feed it to everyone. And
there wasn't enough sugar to keep up. Yeah,
exactly.
That was one thing.
And this has so many different implications. And like, if you go into a coffee shop and Joe here loves this kind of thing, but I always see him with the high-end real sugar soda, because corn syrup soda tastes like shit. And the difference, like if you go into one of these coffee shops and you actually buy like what's called like a Mexican Pepsi, where it's actually real sugar.
In Southern California, we get the Cokes from Mexico with the special sticker on them.
And I grew up in the USSR, where we had imports back in the 80s that were still the real sugar stuff. So that's just one example that I think everyone can relate to. That right there, you say, oh, that soda is just sugar. It's not. It's not even sugar.
No. Right.
It's corn syrup.
Sugar substitute.
So could you get into that a little bit then, the details on that? Because I think you're going to know that better than we do.
Well, I'm not sure exactly when the corn subsidies started, But the 1920s and 1930s is when they started having these technocratic programs to try to engineer what they wanted out of society as a government, and so they started subsidizing the grains, especially since it was seen as a staple crop and everybody needed to have it. Now, of course, they weren't looking at the nutritional value of it back then, and they weren't really interested in the long-term impact of it. But the idea that you could influence society through the food it was eating was very attractive to the politicians. And that's one of the big things is they always talk about subsidies when it comes to burning crops. I'm sure you've heard of that trope before. Well, the reason that they would burn the crops is because they can't deal with the free market. This goes even to the new food programs for Michelle Obama. Is all of these programs are geared towards making a centralized picture of how things should be done, and that, as we all know, it never works out once it hits the ground. I mean, I've never seen a new program work across the board anywhere. But apparently,
for anything, I agree with you completely there.
Exactly. Now the factory approach, despite being flawed, is what drives the idea that we can somehow make a subsidy for everything. And once everybody is on that subsidy or they're benefiting in some way, shape, or form, like the USDA, for instance, they're the ones who delegate the amount of subsidies, and they control the school food programs. Now, they have direct control from what the factory farms make all the way to the schools, and we wonder why the food in the schools turned into such crap. I mean, look at the food in the hospitals. The food in the hospitals is almost worse than what you get at McDonald's. The idea that you can somehow say this is the perfect amount of X or this is the perfect amount of Y, and instead of letting the free market decide how it gets to your door, they think that they can bureaucratically make a system that works better than the people who actually benefit from that system.
Okay.
That, to me, that makes no sense, and that's why the system continually fails forward.
I agree with you in theory very, very closely, and if you read some of my work, it becomes very evident that I'm very, very against bureaucratized society and standardized society and top-down decisions about these kind of things, which 100% with you there. What I'd like to ask you is for a little bit more specificity, like you're talking about, you use the term they, and you talk about politicians in the 1920s and all this, and you did mention the USDA, but do you have any more specific citations or specific references for our listeners to research if they're interested, like which politicians in the 1920s, what agencies, maybe what corporate research was involved, those kind of questions.
All right. Well, where do you want to start at? Because we can go into the programs in the 1930s with the redevelopment.
Honestly, maybe we're better off just posting citations.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think some of these, I think the USDA, isn't that rooted in a alphabet program from FDR during the Depression? And I think wheat is another one we haven't talked about yet. Speaking of subsidies, it's another one that we have too much of in some cases, wheat.
Grain in general, grain's great.
Well, right, but wheat is interesting because that was something that, because of the laws of homesteading and all that back in the kind of early part of the 20th century, people had these gigantic farms, and now with these huge plows, they were just able, because wheat was high at the time, they plowed tons of land over, took away natural grasslands, promoted erosion, and grew shit tons of wheat to the point where they had so much the price dropped and the people's farms were being foreclosed on. That's kind of when the first subsidies, I think, started appearing under Roosevelt, because they basically bought all this wheat because there was too much of it, and just got rid of it. They've disappeared this wheat. And I think that was kind of part of the beginnings of, okay, now we have all this wheat. What do we want to do with it? And I think a lot of it went to rations for the army and things like that.
Okay,
and giveaways to the poor.
The USDA itself was started under Abraham Lincoln, strangely enough. And if you look at some of his speeches about the U.S. economy, it was very obvious why he would want a control over the agrarian culture. He always said we need to have more family-owned farms and people owning their own land and all the rest of the stuff because he thought that was the American tradition. Now, again, the American tradition was very variable. If you look at the cities versus the country and all the rest of it, it's always been a changing concept. For Lincoln, he wanted to see the American farmer come out on top of the American banker. He was very against the type of banking interests.
And it was what he knew. I mean, that's what he came from. So
exactly.
I guess it makes sense.
There's also, throwing in some of the political history at the time, there was the Free Soil Party, which was kind of the one of the precursors to the Republican Party. It was a third party. It was a northern party, and it was kind of the northern anti-federalist party. They were very much against the war. They were very much against a split, but they're kind of, they were, I wouldn't say they were pro-slavery, but they would have preferred to keep slavery to avoid the split and just be like, no, we don't want the federal government basically having the same policies for the North and the South because that's bad for the country. But the reason they were called Free Soil is they actually had the idea, and very close to what you're saying about Lincoln, and Lincoln was pretty sympathetic to them. He was kind of in between them and kind of more mainstream Republicans. The reason they're called Free Soil is they had the idea that all this land that we just acquired from the Mexican-American War 20 years earlier should be distributed essentially for free or very cheaply to people from the cities to get people out of the urbanization that's already going on at the time.
Homestead and farm.
A lot of them were immigrants, and then a lot of them were slavery abolitionists. They just didn't want to do it through war, and they're even saying, let's get the slaves, let's move the slaves out west because where they are in the South, it's going to take hundreds of years for them to really integrate and be seen as equal citizens, and we're seeing that today. And let's give them free land. Let's redistribute it. So it's weird. These guys are kind of ultra-libertarians in their approach, and it's almost communism what they're promoting, right? They're saying, give them this land. It's not being used by anyone to homestead and farm. So Lincoln was very sympathetic to that, and of course his policies became very unpopular with that contingent of the population because of the war. They were the Republicans that were against him. So I wonder how much of what you're talking about, Ben, was him trying to appease them and say, okay, I need these guys on my side politically because, politicians are always trying to build coalitions. So just something to throw in there.
Well, that's also true. He also talked about the pervasiveness of capital, and he didn't want the capital interests to own that land. He would rather see it in the hands of individual private ownership. I think he made that clear on several different occasions. I can't remember the speeches now, but I think that was part of it. If you would have foreign capital investments or even domestic capital investments, it puts everybody into debt, and he was very anti-debt, despite putting the U.S. into one of the worst debts it had been in to date because of the greenback and everything else. But back to agrarian policy, if you look at what Lincoln did, he wanted to increase production, and that goal of just increasing production at all costs is what sort of leads the USDA on to this day, and what leads the factory agrarians on their course too. Monsanto and all the rest of them. It's all about production. It's not about quality, and that's a big problem, I think. Since they were forced into doing crop rotations since the Dust Bowl, they've actually had to look at crop rotations as a way of increasing quality in their product. Now, at the same time, they're still looking at production above all the rest of the quality issues, and that's why you've got most of the corn produced in this country is basically inedible, and it's only used for things like ethanol and feeding to cows and all the rest of this stuff. Is because they're not really interested in the quality of it as long as they can put out as much as possible. And some people would call that efficiency, but when you're talking about food, you've got to take other factors into account before you can say it's an efficiently grown product. For instance, if you're eating silly putty, you're not getting an efficient product, but you can factory farm that silly putty all day long,
I do want to get into the kind of things that Monsanto gets criticized for and just address them since we have you here. The number one thing that, and some of these people take it a little too far, but the legitimate things that are documented they do is, so there's the thing about GMOs. But what does that mean? I think most people would say an example is Monsanto engineered corn, meaning if you have a handful of Monsanto corn, it's green. it's green, and it's not shaped like regular corn, or you would picture a little corn kernel. It looks like candy corn, like green candy corn. And the reason why is because the seed itself is infused with all these chemicals that resist pests. It's already pre-pesticide sprayed, basically. It's engineered to be that way. It's engineered to be drought tolerant. It's engineered to be that. It's created in a lab and basically produced sort of artificially. It's bioengineering, kind of, if I understand correctly. But that's one thing, but it's patented. And I think kind of what the lawsuit thing is A, it indemnifies them from basically engineering it wrong and killing people in case that happens, because I think they know that could happen one of these days. The minute you're playing God, I guess. And the other thing is, the number one thing farmers bring up is if there have been people who have had instances of Monsanto seeds falling on their field from another guy who's next door, and then if they cultivate that, because a lot of farmers, if they have their own seed, they take the corn kernels and save them for next year. But if you take Monsanto ones and try to reuse them, a lot of them are bred to not be able to do that. And you're actually, when you buy Monsanto seeds, you sign a contract saying, I won't do that. You have to buy them every year. There's another thing like that. So it gets really complicated from there. But that's kind of the same things you've read?
Right there is we're looking at the backlash against the idea that somehow you can own a genetic code. And somehow
they patented it.
That
right, exactly.
Yeah. That ownership of genetic code should be protected by the government, A, and B, it should not be subject of liable or any sort of lawsuit. And that the idea that somehow the ownership of a genetic piece of material will help society in general, I think that needs further examination. Now, I'm not saying that you can't make better things through genetic engineering. I'm just saying, should you be able to own that genetic material when, let's face it, you really didn't make it. You just sort of threw it together, And is it really okay to own fish DNA, to own, parts of the human genome, things like that? Because we're looking at a future where everything medicine-wise is going to be genetically engineered to your specific person. That's just the way things have been going up until now, and I think it's going to continue. That's the way that the development of the medicine world is going to go. Now, if somebody can own part of your DNA and sell the medicine back to you, how legitimate is that?
Well, I remember reading there was some legal battle with a person who was immune to this certain disease, like they carried in them an antibody that was developed by a pharma, and I don't have the source on this, but I remember reading this a while ago, and they were trying to go to patent the gene, and really it comes from, the seed of it was this person, and the person ended up going, wait a minute, you're patenting my genes. Yeah, you can't do that. It's just hilarious. And I don't know how that turned out, but this is the kind of ground that we're going legally, where we're going in this country. It's crazy.
Here's my thing, and this is kind of, I agree with you guys, but I don't. First of all, if we take the mentality, and you got to bear with me on this, that, okay, well, you didn't really make it, you just put it together. You really can't patent anything. This computer screen that I'm looking at, none of the stuff in it people really made, right? They just took things in nature, and we manipulated them, and we changed them, and, we worked on the metal, and, everything we have.
Built on something, I guess,
right,
yeah.
Right. Everything comes from something. We didn't make any. We really don't make anything, no matter how hard we like to think that we do. And if we don't have patenting of things that are medically needed or things that are, for agriculture or whatever, we're really not going to have an incentive for people to produce useful things. We really cannot take away that. That is a market incentive. They need the patent so they can make profit off of what they've made. So I don't necessarily
That's a different discussion.
have a problem with the patenting. Yeah. What I have a problem with, that's a different show. What I have a problem with, and this is kind of what I'd like for us to get into, is how limited the market is in deciding who patents this stuff and what gets patented. If you look at we always hear about this, how few news conglomerates there are, how few major banks there are. Mm-hmm. So the worst industries by far are the ones where a few large corporations control everything. And you'd think you'd never hear a libertarian say that, but no, real libertarians are not for corporatism at all. And if I would say by far the worst industry in those terms is the agricultural industry. So I think if we had many, many, many smaller businesses and smaller interests patenting this stuff, I don't think it would be as much of a problem. Because honestly, these are some of the most unenforceable patents in the world. Like Joe said, you can patent my genes, but what are you going to do, really? Laws only go as far as they're enforceable. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that. So this is not a battle anyone patenting this stuff can win in the long run in terms of owning somebody else's DNA. It's mind-boggling that anyone thinks that's really going to happen. What I'm saying is, I think we're patenting the wrong stuff, and where there's not enough competition. I feel like that's more of a problem than the patenting itself.
Well, if you look at the process of how genetic modifications are done, it's actually fairly simple. You take the genes you want, you propagate them in cultures, and then you basically shoot them at the plants that you want to manifest those genes. Now, whether or not it manifests in the way that you want or not is a matter of long-term testing and a lot of other different factors. But basically, that's it. You take the genes you want, you shoot them at the plant using what they call a gene gun, which is a whole other issue in and of itself. Is are you getting a mutation that you want, or are you getting something completely random? Which, that goes into the whole Dr. Frankenstein science of this whole thing, is do you really know what you're getting, and is that going to cross-pollinate with a whole bunch of other things? And that's the biggest thing, is the cross-pollination. If you've got this stuff that you really have no long-term studies on the effect, and it goes into my field and it contaminates my crops with its pollen, that's my next crop is going to be half of that Frankenstein material, and it might not produce any more seeds viable for me the next time around. So not only did they contaminate my crops, but now I'm liable because I'm growing half of their crops, and because that's what Monsanto has done before. They've had seeds fall off a truck, grow in somebody's field, and they test it to find out that, yeah, those are their genetic property. Therefore, they can sue that farmer. Well, now it's cross-pollinating across a field using nothing but air, and now they could sue that person, and that person doesn't get any more seeds that they can plant in the ground for the next generation. That's a big problem. If you look at it in terms of a policy, that's almost a form of warfare. They're using their plants to wage war on the people who are growing things that aren't theirs.
Who don't choose to use it. Yeah.
I agree with you that this is a problem, 100%, Ben. My concern, what I'm saying is I don't think it's necessarily can be boiled down to the patenting. Honestly, I feel like this boils down to the size of Monsanto relative to the rest of their agricultural industry. If this just a few seeds falling off a truck, which this happens. This is normal in farming. It's not just the big corporate seeds. Other people's seeds can fall, and my neighbors, I'm a family farmer, my neighbor's a family farmer.
Usually those are patented by somebody.
It's right, but the reason that Monsanto can afford to patent these seeds that are going all across the country is because of just their sheer volume of the share of this industry, in my opinion. If it's okay if you had one farmer and his seeds, even if they were patented, fall in another farmer's field, I think they could work something out. It's just the power inequality between family farmers and these just monstrous agricultural corporations. And I feel like the reason for that inequality is the subsidies. What do you think on that, Ben? Yeah. Well, Joe, did you have a...
I would agree that the subsidies are a big part. You also have to look at the former employees of Monsanto. You've got Hillary Clinton, former lawyer for Monsanto, and she always sticks up for them anytime she gets the chance. You've also got the Supreme Court Justice, the only
Clarence
black...
Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, former Monsanto attorney. Anytime he makes a statement, he rarely ever makes statements in the Supreme Court. When he does, it's generally in favor of Monsanto. And you've also got the head of the FDA being the former executive of Monsanto. And having these employees in power is basically automatic subsidy. You can never get anything that makes sense out of people who are so committed to this idea of loyalty to Monsanto. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think, is the political connectedness. You're not going to be able to fix that through government because it is a government problem. I think it's going to take a concerted effort of the consumer to stop buying Monsanto products. And that's going to be one of those issues that's just not going to go away. It has to be on the consumer. If the consumer stops buying it, it will stop being subsidized. It will stop being supported. That's the big issue. That's
that's the moral quandary that most ordinary people, when they hear about the cross-pollination problem, you were saying that a farmer, through no fault of their own, who decided on their own not to use their product, gets it forced upon them if enough of his neighbors do, just by forces of nature that you can't control. No one person can. The idea is that they've patented a grain and they've taken it to be their own, and they basically want to own corn, and they're basically just going to divide and conquer until they do. And that's the problem I think most ordinary people have, and why things get so heated when it's discussed, if I'm reading everything correctly here. Because that is a real problem. Enough of the neighbors' farms have those seeds, it's just going to start spreading. That's what plants do.
Well, again, the connection I want to make, and this gets a little more political, but we tend to get more political as we move through the show, is that if you look at some of the other kind of monstrous industries in this country, banking, for example, Wall Street is always my number one enemy for this reason. And you look at this is where we're going to go, where libertarians and progressives are always going to meet. And you look at guys like Eric Cantor, who just get shamefully just taken by the scruff of their necks and thrown out of a political leadership position because people are so sick of them. And it is grief. This man, who, I mean, like, who's going to give this guy a job? This is like
a bank.
Loser number one, right?
I forget where he went. Was it Goldman?
It was either Goldman Sachs or Chase, one of the two.
Yeah, it was one of them.
And he goes and takes a job
I think it was Chase.
that pays six times what he received as a congressman.
Oh, it makes sense.
As a lobbyist for a major Wall Street bank.
Right.
So this whole, buddy, we're just, I'm a politician today and I'm your lobbyist tomorrow. This is a very common thing with certain industries. Of course, the defense industry, the defense contractor industry is another. And it's mind-boggling. Well, finance, banking is very similar.
And agribusiness.
Right. So where I was going with that, is that we recognize that. And I feel a lot of, liberals are kind of considered traditionally to be the more anti-corporate of the two sides in this country. And liberals tend to recognize that for banks, and they recognize that for defense. And somehow it's lost on them, the impact of the agricultural industry on this, just their participation in this same issue, in this same problem. And I mean, I hear about this all the time, and I've talked about agricultural subsidies for a very long time, and about how, obviously a lot of this was introduced in the 1930s by very liberal administration at the time, FDR and the New Deal. Those were Democrats, folks. Those were not Republicans. And we think of corporatism as a Republican thing, but it's not necessarily. It certainly is. I'm just saying it's not limited to that. Again, like if you talk about, for example, one program I always bring up is SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. And anytime anyone dares to point out that's any kind of problem with SNAP whatsoever, anything you dare touch SNAP, and you have these, they're not even like liberal Democrats, they're more like moderate. Oh my God, you want to take the food away from the poor people. But really, SNAP is an agricultural subsidy. It's part of the annual farm bill. That's what it's considered in policy terms. It's not a handout. It's not a social assistance policy. It's an agricultural subsidy. And that money goes to corporations like Monsanto, and it guarantees them a market for this crap. So if you want to talk about owning basically owning the domain of the economy, owning the market. Okay, you can own the production side where you have, your seeds falling on somebody's field, but you're also owning the consumption market,
guaranteeing people that are going to buy the crap that you produce.
Because if you're suffering from food insecurity, if you're living under the poverty line, and the only way you can acquire food is through the SNAP program,
and by what we say you can buy with it,
then you're forced to go.
You can't support local growers.
Right,
you can't
large
buy
chain
vegetables
grocery
locally.
stores.
You have to go to a grocery store.
Right, and buy the
buy grain that we subsidize. Yeah, exactly.
So that's
part
kind
of the problem.
so
and we've talked about that end of it, the consumer end of it before, but it's all part. You're right. It is part of the same ecosystem. Let's say, money in, money out. It's all kind of going to the same place. Follow the money. It takes you there every time.
Right.
That sort of goes back to the food program in the schools, the school lunch program and the school breakfast programs. Those are all part of the same subsidy program. There's really no boundary between that and the SNAP card. When the public schools are paying for the food through taxpayer money, that comes out of the same subsidy. So there's really no way of drawing the boundary between the government program and the business end of these companies like Monsanto. So In fact, I would actually, when you take it in perspective, I would actually say that Monsanto is a branch of the government. It is the agricultural branch of the government. There's no difference from the agricultural subsidy all the way to where it gets to the door of that person who's using their SNAP card. So why is it not part of the government? I think maybe even including a bill or a runner or something that would recognize Monsanto as being a part of the government might make people at least wake up to the fact that none of these SNAP programs are to benefit the people who are receiving them as much as the corporate welfare for the businesses that are using this taxpayer money.
So you feel that if it were actually basically at this point, if we acknowledge that we have essentially a socialized food supply, and with like government-run collective farms, well, not collective farms, but government-run farms almost, that this may actually benefit us as a country in a policy sense, because then there would be a little more accountability. People would at least be willing to hold the politicians accountable and the the executives accountable for what happens as a result. At least having
recognition of the process.
So you kind of want them to be seen how Raytheon and Northrop Grumman are seen as basically just arms of the DoD. That's exactly where they get stuff from, and that's just the way it works. Yeah. I can see that.
I mean,
it is the truth. I mean, if you look into it, so.
The idea that Boeing can somehow make these drones, sell them to the government for whatever price, because there's the economic calculation problem when it comes down to these government contractors. Who's actually determining this price and why? Is there any sort of value placed on these objects that we're buying? None of this comes into the factor because it's all decided by a bureaucracy. Somebody else somewhere in some room is deciding how much the value of this thing is. And that's the real problem that I come down to whenever I examine the government is the fact that the economic calculation problem is always applied when it comes down to socialist programs for society, but it's never applied to defense. Nobody ever brings that up in that arena. The Republicans never bring it up, and that's one of the things that I have a big problem with is none of this stuff is actually valued in a free market. It's just pushed.
And those meetings usually don't happen with cameras in the room, too.
I'd like to add not just defense, but law enforcement is another one that goes right in on the same lines. The prison industry and any kind of the borders and just police militarization.
Prison industry is another one with food, because where do you think all that subsidized crap they can't sell in the open market goes to?
Absolutely.
Prisoners.
All the
Very
feed,
good.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. That's where all that edible simple grains and corn go.
What do you have to say about that, Ben?
Well, the prison industry actually has a better food program than most high schools. And
that's sick.
It's true. It's true. If you look at the numbers and the figures, they actually get better, more nutritious food than the high schools. And the fact is, they don't really have as much choice because they have to eat what they're given. So there's not as many vending machines that are there are no vending machines that are used other than the what's it called? The canteen. So,
right.
and the canteen is a rare occasion anyway. I mean, I don't care what you say. You're not getting a ton of money for canteen every week if you're in prison. So the issues there is if you go to prison, you're actually getting a more nutritious meal than if you go to high school. And that's really sick. But at the same time, it's the result of the central planning. If there was more choice, if there was more freedom to decide how things are going to go in your own life, it would not be occurring that way. But that's the factory society.
So let me throw in a little bit of my own personal experience with this and with growing up in the USSR. And I haven't really, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the show, but my mother is a software engineer, but she spent about 15 years in the USSR actually working for their agricultural industry, if you can even call it that. That's how bad it was. It's funny, one of her
the rape Ukraine industry.
Well, that's happened earlier. That was the 30s. That was before her time. This is more like the 70s, early 80s. But she had a friend who worked with her, is actually also in the U.S. now, who would say, you really need to stop trying to fix the Soviet agricultural industry because you're not going to succeed. Because just the way she was devoted to her work.
So they somehow it improved from using tanks as farm implements?
No, it really hasn't. So here's the thing. So so where I'm going with this, and again, you guys got to bear with me, you got to kind of let me talk this out, is the USSR in the 20s, maybe a little bit later than this country, like maybe like the late 30s, really they had kind of the same approach that Ben is describing here, is we just need to produce. Now, they were more about wheat and rye than they were about corn, because that's what grows in Eastern Europe. It's not a corn place, it's a wheat place. And of course, the Ukraine and Belarus is another big one that you never hear about. The other place where they produce a lot of the wheat. So Stalin kind of had the same thing. We need to raise more. We need more. We need not even more nutrition, just more calories, more volume, like you were saying, Ben. Now, what he didn't have is this pesky thing called democracy and any kind of government accountability whatsoever that he had to worry about. And this is kind of very unfortunate. A lot of the problems that you see today in Ukraine go right back to this. The other issue that he had is he needed to rapidly industrialize the country as he was gearing up for World War II, because Russia in the 20th century, when the communists took over, was really kind of stuck about in the 1850s when in comparison to the U.S. or the Western world in terms of industrial development. So they could only afford to do one, and we've talked about this before, there's a lot of crimes against humanity involved in this too, where you just take all the farmers in Ukraine and Belarus, because they were still proprietary farmers into the 30s in the USSR, despite them claiming to be a communist society. And they just basically, the KGB would come in, forcefully take all their grain, and force them to go into the collective farms where they didn't own anything. They didn't own the animals, they didn't own the grain, they didn't own the land, to force them to work on it. And one way they destroyed their agriculture is anyone that was worth a shit as a farmer tried to resist this, and they would just be killed or starve to death. But more importantly than that, or arguably more importantly, another thing they did is all of the agricultural equipment that was developed, as we've talked about on the show before, was developed with the intent that it could be converted into military technology if necessary. So basically, it's on treads. You have like a farm tractor that's on treads, and if you need it, you just take off the top, put on some armor, and now it's a tank. Well, that's great for fighting wars, but if you plow your bread fields with tanks, you might not have anything to plow next year. Just, a thought, right? It might be a swamp next year. So when I look at that, and obviously that's an extreme, and, obviously you have a lot going on there, a lot more than just agricultural abuse. You have just plain human rights abuses. But when I look at the U.S. agricultural industry, we're really the next worst thing. We like to pride ourselves over this free market economy, and if you look at some of the politics in the 20s and the 30s, a lot of the comparisons were made. Look, FDR is basically doing what Stalin was doing minus the force and the tanks, and people are applauding this. This is sick. And if you look at agriculture in Europe, and I'm not a Europhile. I'm not one of these idiots that goes around, oh, look, Europe is this perfect little utopia and the U.S. sucks. No, that's not true at all. But when it comes to agriculture, it's on target. Another big place is the Middle East and Israel. The way they do their farming, a lot of them are small farming communes. So yes, farming is something that doesn't necessarily work very well in the modern age with just individual proprietary farmers. There was a time when that was the kind of the staple of the economy. Not so much anymore. Yes, you kind of need a commune for a variety of reasons. And if you look at some of the kind of the propagators of Israel, they actually came out of Tsarist Russia in the late 19th century, and even some of the people in Western Europe, some of the farmers basically in France, Spain, those people were migrants. They were the communists claimed to be taking their economic ideas, and these people were so terrified that they ran. And they ran to other countries, and they were refugees, and they started some of the communal farming in those countries. Whereas in the U.S., of all places, we actually kind of took the Soviet model, and we softened it, and we corporatized it to be more palatable to the voters. But in a nutrition sense, it's hardly better. So kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that, but I know it's kind of a lot, but this is not something a lot of people think about.
You're talking about the kibbutzim, right?
The kibbutz is a kind of an extreme example because, yes, that's a cooperative, and of course it's completely voluntary. People can leave if they want, but it's actually you have to go in there and you sign a contract that everything here is collectively owned, and I get so much out of it, and I have to put in so much work, and they can vote me off the island. So that's one example, and yes, it's very heavily based in like the ideas of actually Lev Tolstoy. He's a Russian writer, but who's also very big into trying to develop like real agrarian communism.
Well, I would take the example of shareholders. You've got communal farming going on in this country where you've got shareholders in that operation who come to the farm to collect their goods and work as needed to keep the thing going.
Right. And that's actually kind of where I was going. I think a less extreme example of what I'm talking about. This happens a lot in Southern Europe, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, those countries. More what you're describing. So it's not as let's say as strictly cooperative as Israel. There's a little more private ownership going on, but it's still a commune.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think that's a great way of getting nutrition back into the communities that are so badly in need of nutrition. For instance, the inner city farming and urban farming in general is a great way of educating and spreading the idea that these nutrients matter. These things are going to affect your life, I think it's the education, I think, needs to come first. People need to understand what their body chemistry is, and actually thinking about and looking into their body chemistry is the first step in understanding what they need to introduce into their diet so that they can have a more holistic lifestyle, have a more healthy lifestyle. I think that's where I'm going with that. And the communal farming idea is a good one, and I think there needs to be more attention paid to that as opposed to mandating what you can and cannot eat in schools, because there's only going to be backlash. There's only going to be rebellion. If a school had a farm or a garden even where they could learn about food, you're going to find better educated consumers who are less likely to have damaging health impact in the future. If you look at Obama's promises about Obamacare, he would always talk about preventative medicine. We need to have more preventative medicine. Well, there's no better preventative medicine than actually having good nutrition. And that's not going to come about through a government mandate. That's where they fail every time,
Our high school actually had a little garden, a little farm thing. If FFA kids would have livestock. It was pretty small.
They
but
prided themselves on being the only school in the county with
right,
that
I know,
program.
it's rare.
That's
rare.
sick. No, but with Ben is
I
saying, when
remember
you think
seeing
about it,
those,
what's more important than food?
Right.
And you have one school in a county
yet
of
it's
3
rare,
million,
yeah.
right, that has that. So
we kind of went to school in kind of an area of San Diego that's kind of prides itself on its farming history. So that's part of the reason. It's culturally influenced a little bit too. So
if you look at the field of nutritional politics now, you're starting to see the rise of the educated consumer. And I think that's a very promising sign, and that needs to be fostered. And a lot of people talk about the overreactions to GMO and all the rest of the stuff. If you're not educated about these topics, it's always going to seem like an overreaction. When I hear any mainstream news article, if any, about GMO, it's always glowing. It's always praising it. It never has anything bad to say about it. And that's the type of mentality that's so devoid of any sort of honor or integrity. Do
you remember the high fructose corn syrup commercials?
Oh man,
were those not the most pathetic thing you've ever seen? Oh my god. I've heard there are people saying that it's not so good, but you know what? I like it, and so does my family, so I guess it's fine.
That's one of the major lobbying.
That's where your lobbying dollars come from, America. Yeah, that's where they go to. I mean, those commercials make me laugh.
Lobby wrote the food pyramid. I mean, I can't stress that enough. The junk food lobby actually wrote and made the food pyramid.
Oh, that's been uncovered as the biggest piece of bullshit ever.
It is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely. And I grew up with that. That's what I grew up with in this country.
Doctors, as they're going through their education to become medical doctors, have 3 hours total in their entire education in college about nutrition. 3 credit hours. 1 class. That's it. All the rest of the problems that they treat comes from, at least in some way, shape, or form, nutrition, and they only have 3 credit hours to cover that topic. That's insane.
Well, that would explain why when you go to a doctor in this country, if you're having some sort of obesity or nutrition or diet-related problem, rather than tell you to eat better and exercise, they give you pills, right?
Stop looking at me.
I'm not even looking at you, but okay. But really, I mean,
to be fair, mine told me I should exercise some.
Oh, they always tell you. Anyone can tell you should exercise. I've been telling you should exercise since we were 15. The whole point of being a doctor, and I can tell you this from, like I said, from the perspective of someone that is in a helping profession as a social worker. Obviously, we don't deal with physical health as much, but still, is just telling someone what you tell the client. This is actually what my supervisor told me when I was in training in grad school. What you tell the client goes straight down the toilet. It's what you can get the client to tell you. So if they're telling you to exercise right there, you just incriminated that doctor. They're not doing anything for you. Oh, but here's pills so you don't have to. You need exercise, Joe, but here's pills so you don't have to. That's what they're really doing.
Exactly. I mean, how many times have you gone to the doctor and the doctor says, well, why don't you introduce kale into your diet?
I've never heard that.
Never. But kale is one of the most nutritious vegetables out there. I mean, if you include kale in one of your meals every day, you're going to start to feel changes in a week. You know, that's how powerful food is. If you look to see the most nutritious, the most valuable vegetables and fruits out there, and just introduce them into your diet. Don't even take out the cheeseburger. Just introduce them. You're going to start to see changes, and you're going to like those changes. You know, you may not like the taste, but guess what? All you're doing is adding on. You're not taking anything away. That's what I want to get to, you know?
It should be one of those people that grinds it into a smoothie or something.
Right. And my follow-up question on that, just kind of a balanced question for you, Ben, and I'm in no way disagreeing with what you're saying, is how do you feel about the other extreme? I mean, you're talking about how there's very little kind of media integrity, and that's probably because the media, in my opinion, just plain does not understand food. If the doctors don't understand nutrition, what chance does CNN have? What chance does News Corp have? I mean, even biased and just slant notwithstanding, they don't know what they're talking about. But what is your take on kind of the other side, kind of the natural news of the world, where it just seems to me like when I read this stuff, and I read stuff from a very empirical perspective, and one, it's just seething with exaggeration, with flowery adjectives, and with words that don't mean anything, but they sound very attractive. And if you kind of read into it and you try to, I mean, if you dig deep enough, you can find, okay, maybe some of the problems that they're mentioning are real problems, but just the way that stuff is presented and the way that stuff is kind of given to the consumer to read, and it's really, in my opinion, not very educational. You're going to produce a lot of nuts, people that are crazy to begin with.
Science is sort of minimized.
Right, and you're going to basically just take people who are already conspiracy theorists and they're very suspicious of everything, and they need an outlet for that, and they kind of like they become nutrition freaks, and that becomes their outlet, as opposed to some crazy cult religion like that would have happened in the 80s. But I'm really not seeing how that's making just average Americans better consumers of food. What do you think on that?
I would agree to a point. I think it is a competitive environment, and a lot of the times, I think natural news especially, they print clickbait, you know?
Oh, completely.
They got the salacious headlines, and that's what you're clicking on because you've got to read the rest of it. It's sort of a tabloid approach to nutrition, and it's not good because it gives people the wrong impression about what you're saying, and at the same time, it makes you less credible. But I think the attempt there is to try to get it out to as many people as possible and let the pieces fall where they may. That's a problem. That's why you need to educate yourself to a greater degree. And I think if I could leave you with anything else, I would say read all sides of the argument. Don't stop at a article by Natural News and go off the handle on whatever fad they're trying to push on you, but integrate what they're trying to get across into your knowledge base, because I think that's the important factor. If you can integrate as many sources as possible, click on sources. Don't just read the article. That's the biggest problem I have.
That's lazy. Yeah, that's lazy.
And then they're
distilling it for you. They're interpreting it for you when you do that. You
got to read those PDFs sometimes. Sometimes it's that important because it is the rest of your life. It is your mind. It is your body. So if I could leave you with anything, I would leave you with that. But I got to get going.
Thank you very much for being with us, Ben. We appreciate it. Thank you for your for your suggestions. You have policy suggestions. You have suggestions for our listeners for how they should change their nutrition and their approach to it and their health. And we think that's great. We thank you for your time. One thing I am going to ask you to do, and I'm going to promise our listeners that we're going to have this, is if you could send us some of the sources, some of the stuff where because you've really distilled a lot of information. It's great information, but kind of following what your final suggestion there about sources. If you could send us some links, maybe some articles, maybe some sources, some websites, some of the stuff where you've looked up, where you educate yourself. It doesn't have to be exact references for stuff you've said, because I understand you've said a lot, and that's we're taking up a lot of your time. Just so we could share those with our listeners on our website, and maybe to go like in a file to go with the podcast, so that if people hopefully want to do further research as a result of this and they want to look into this stuff, they would know where to turn to.
Okay, I will.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you being with us.
Okay, so we spoke with Ben, and obviously a lot of things came up.
Thanks, Ben, for being with us.
Obviously, and there's one thing I want to kind of throw in. You were a little bit more, and I think he kind of was too. You guys kind of treated what agribusiness looks like today like it was created from whole cloth and arranged that way from the beginning. And I think that isn't quite what happened, at least based on what I've read. And it was, okay. I wanted to throw this out there to get your reaction of it. Wasn't it more that FDR just kind of was a supporter of, let's say, government support of farms, and it was sort of exacerbated by the wheat thing we talked about in the Dust Bowl? It's where it started, isn't it? I mean, a lot, or let's say it meaning the modern agribusiness model we have today. Okay. It started, in my opinion, innocently enough. He was trying to stabilize prices, save property. I know you're nodding because that's not what
laughing.
You see it, but the at least one purpose, and obviously it wasn't the whole purpose. He had other ideas for that money, but one of the reasons was because it was very politically visible, and in the short term, it seemed like he was helping farmers out. And what ended up happening now is these guys start buying each other, and then the big company starts buying all the little ones because they realize I can suck many teats all at the same time that way. Now we have this monster that needs the government teat to live, and that's what we have now. Anyway.
So here's the thing. I cannot go back 80 years in history and pretend to understand the motivations of a man who's been dead about that long. Well, been dead for 70, but he did it 80 years ago.
Yeah.
However, I have a huge problem with FDR apologism in terms of intentions. First of all, no politician deserves apologism based on intentions, ever. If a plumber came into your house because you had a leak and he meant well, but your entire house is flooded with shit, you'd say he was a shitty plumber. You wouldn't say, well, he meant well.
What?
And we give politicians a pass, even though the impact of their shitty decisions, literally...
I wasn't evaluating his morality.
Okay, no, but you were saying he intended to help farmers.
Well, no, I'm saying it wasn't... Okay, he didn't say, I want to make this huge agribusiness cabal.
Of course, because if he said that, he'd get thrown out of office.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
Why don't you think he wanted that?
I am saying, I don't know what he wanted. We don't know, but I'm saying we cannot judge politicians by their intentions. That is something that we really need to do away with, because I think it hurts us politically. Now, moving on to what happened there and what you're saying. Here's some interesting numbers that I throw out there in response to what you just said. Is that before the 1930s, or in the 1930s, when the New Deal is implemented, when the kind of agricultural subsidies as we know them today began, we had 25% of this country living on farms. 25%. This is the 1930s, not the 1830s.
Right.
And we had, I want to say, the actual number escapes me, but let's just put it this way. We had 10 times as many farms as we do today.
And so that was because of government programs. There were land programs and things.
Some of them were. There were some government programs that were involved. But the point is, you had that many farms. And now, we have 1/10 the farms, and we have maybe 2 million people living on farms, and that's about, well, that's less than 2%, because obviously, I believe, was it 2 million or 2%? I want to say it's 2% of people living on farms now. We went from 25% to 2%. So, regardless of what the intention was, I don't care what the intention was. I don't think that's relevant, because I don't think we can know what the intentions of course, it wasn't just one person, of an administration that's been gone for almost 80 years were. What I can tell you is that these policies of subsidizing corporate farms, and like Ben said, I think very on target, having a precise central planning idea, this is what we need to do, this is what we want to produce, it's this one standard, this one goal, and then we're going to regulate everything around it. This is the outcome. bureaucratic monstrosities. See, bureaucratic monstrosities, people think when I talk about bureaucracy, I'm talking about government. No. Bureaucracy is just that top-down, centralized standardization. And when it's corporate, it actually tends to be worse than when it's government. Not that I'm advocating for either.
Anyone who wants to challenge him on that, I advise you to call HP technical support if your laptop has a problem, and tell me how efficiently you get service. I'm just saying.
So,
I'm just saying.
When I hear this stuff about, oh, well, FDR meant well and he wanted to help the farmers.
I didn't even really say that.
True. I'm not saying you.
I just said he didn't intend to create this monster. I think he would be surprised at what is resulted.
Okay, but by that same logic, Lincoln would be turning over in his grave looking at this based on what Ben told us about and some of the things I didn't know about. So, again, my thing is, it makes a very poor apology for FDR. When your policy creates a monster, you're responsible.
I just think it's pointless to go back that far when we want to slay this dragon. That's the real aim here. Because so many new things have come in since then to make what we have today.
The reason I think it does make sense to go back that far is, one, because subsidies have hardly changed since the 30s. It's one of the oldest unchanged political domains, and we just think this holy grail that we can't touch. Well, it's finally starting to get challenged in the modern age, but it's still way too little.
And here's where we agree. I think that people need to get hammered into their heads this image of the independent family farmer that depends on the subsidies to survive. It's fucking bullshit.
It is.
It's fucking bullshit, because the farmers that need the subsidies, that actually are independent, that are at the farmers markets every week, the guy you see down there, that's not the guy getting a subsidy check every month. All right? It isn't. Monsanto is. And they're the ones with lobbyists in Washington to make sure those checks arrive on time every month.
Now,
so that's number one.
The other reason, the second reason, arguably bigger than the first, that it does make sense to go that far back, is you look at this policy, and if this is not what it's intended to create, that's more reason to get rid of it and more reason to never make policy that resembles it again. Because even when you have government policy that's well-intentioned, that's intended to help the little guy, that's supposed to improve the food supply and help people hold on to their farms and basically preserve a dying economic trend and make sure that everyone keeps what they have, this is the outcome. This is the result. This is how good government is at doing that. And not only is it this great at doing that, then you can't get rid of it. Then the monster takes on a life of its own, and you cannot. Reforming the policy takes decades. That's where we are with defense. That's where we are with banking. All of these industries come from somebody allegedly being well-intentioned and wanting to help the little guy and keep people from suffering from the Great Depression and protect us from terrorism, and here's the result. There is what you're looking at. But when you talk about defense, when you talk about the law enforcement industry and the prison industry, when you talk about banks, liberals tend to agree with me that those are corporate monstrosities. Whether or not they're well-intentioned, they've got to go. They're corrupt. They're terrible. There's no accountability. This is not... You don't hear very many liberals saying they're well-intentioned. But you get into agriculture, and then health is the other big one. And somehow, those are not corporatocracies, and those, because they were intended to help the little guy, the government just made a mistake. I don't care if they just made a mistake. That's how you don't learn from your mistakes, is saying, oh, we were well-intentioned, so we'll give you a pass, so we can just keep doing the same thing over and over because it was well-intentioned the first time. That's when I hear that's what I hear when I hear that.
I guess I look at any kind of corporate government partnership as Lewis Black describing when Republicans and Democrats work together.
Yeah.
And it'd be dumber is when these pricks work together. Yeah. And that's always the worst of both worlds, usually.
Right. But again, in my opinion, I agree with you. It's just bureaucratization where there's also a profit motive. I have no problem with profit motive.
Institutionalizing these shit companies and making them so they never die.
Right. Now, basically, you have the profit motive there, but you don't have the accountability and the checks
or the
of the free market
to
of competition.
Keep them from running wild.
So, I mean, there's some things that, in my opinion, need to stay public, not private. Prisons, for one. Because that's not something that should really involve a profit motive. But things like healthcare, agriculture, in my business,
we see that here in electricity generation in this state.
Oh yeah,
that's another one.
Yeah,
they're a government-sanctioned monopoly, and they just basically act as brazenly as they want. Oh, our power lines caused a massive fire that destroyed thousands of homes in your city and caused huge. We'll pay your settlement. Oh, by the way, next month we're raising your rates so that we have money to pay the settlement. Yeah. You guys are cool with that, right?
And I
This
want
is
to
what
point out, I mean,
happens.
this may be a good place to close out, but
It's a
I want to
different
point out
show.
that was stopped. And it was stopped because at least that is something that's controlled at the county level.
That was
Can
stopped? That I
yes,
didn't
that
know.
was stopped. And can you imagine? Okay, let's make the comparison.
I remember my
between that-
rates going up though, so I'm interested.
Well, they do go up, but they wanted to raise them way more.
Okay,
And
we
basically
won't
the
fuck you
county
without
came-
lube. How about this? We'll get warming lube.
No,
and
they're
we'll fuck
allowed.
you with that.
Okay, what it is, the charter allows them to raise the rates a certain amount per year, and they wanted to raise them more, and the county was like, "You guys are funny." But again, it took a lot of upheaval. I mean, it took a lot of work on the part of activists and people that just despise this corporation, and I'm one of them. And I don't despise them because they're corporate. I despise them because they're a government-sanctioned monopoly, like Joe
Yes.
said. It took a lot at the county level to beat them. And again, they're bitterly despised for causing wildfires. Think about that. Wildfires affect everyone, and you can't breathe. Think about this at the federal level. Trying to stop agribusiness or defense contractors or prison industrial contractors or banks that are doing the same thing. Trying to coordinate a counter movement to get to hold the politicians accountable. It's completely out of the question. That's the idea that you're going to stop it within. I mean, it's still a monopoly. They just stopped it from making a bad decision, from doing one thing, basically from getting one bad policy passed. That's not going to happen at the federal level, even at the state level in a state like California, people. You really have to take the monster down. You cannot try to put a leash around its neck.
Two quick things. I've worked inside that company that shall not be named for a little while, and believe me, if you think a government can burn cash, you have not worked at a government-sanctioned monopoly. Wow, they spent money just to spend it some days. Anyway, I just want to close the show out with a completely unrelated political note that I just wanted to cite since it was a big thing that was in the news. Congratulations, Elizabeth Warren, for at least getting the fact that Wall Street banks were having a huge giveaway in that big crumb the bus bill, at least in the news and popular, and even got kudos from Rand Paul.
Right, I've always said those.
And so
two,
this whole idea that we've been talking about, the Talks have been saying, that kind of I've been saying to somebody, that those two sides, they have a lot more in common than maybe people want to admit, and maybe even they'd want to admit, that they do have common enemies. And the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So,
I don't see them not admitting it, in all honesty. I mean, Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders, which you can kind of look at as the two predecessors of these two, because they've been around a lot longer than either of them, they worked together on a lot of anti-Wall Street stuff. I mean, the bill that, I mean, it failed, but the bill to audit the Federal Reserve was jointly authored by Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul, and Dennis Kucinich was involved, but I mean, Bernie Sanders at the Senate level and Ron Paul at the House level. I mean, there's bipartisanship, right? We want to scream about
that's bipartisanship I want to see more of, yeah.
And I'm sick of seeing bipartisanship be basically, okay, we need to fuck you over in order for the government to work. Well, if that's what you need, then turn
we
the
fuck
damn
you over
thing
with
off.
this dildo or that dildo.
No, it's the same.
That's
but
been the
as
choice.
soon as it becomes one dildo, somehow that's
it's
a
one
good thing.
two-headed
Right.
dildo, right? Yeah, exactly.
In any
But the
case,
same dude holding it.
That's a different show, and of course we have to throw
such
dildos
a tasty metaphor
into
isn't
every
it?
show, to end on. So, thank you for listening. I'm Neurotoxin.
I'm Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show, edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Edge of Chaos Show. We can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/The Edge of Chaos. Neurotoxins blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, fyg.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.
And for all we study about health, we know nothing. Is milk good or bad? I rest my case. You don't know. You don't know anymore. And a lot of you were sitting there thinking, fuck, I'm an adult. I don't have to drink that shit anymore. When I was a kid, you knew milk was good. Because there was only one kind of milk, moo cow fuck milk, and that was it. And you had to drink 4 glasses a day. Now you don't know, because when you go down the aisle of the grocery store, there's milk. The milk aisle goes on for fucking ever. There's 1%, 2%, low fat, skim, acidophilus milk. What the fuck are you talking about? Acidophilus milk? Milk doesn't need a friend. That shit belongs in the yogurt section. Lactose intolerant milk, kiss my dick. If you're lactose intolerant, you can't drink milk. So what's in the fucking carton? Get it out of there. Get it away from my milk. It is talking to my milk and making it feel bad about itself. Soy milk. Beyond belief, I was in Los Angeles and I ordered some coffee and they said, would you like whole milk, skim milk, or soy milk? And my fist stopped right in his face. There's no such thing as soy milk. It's soy juice. But they couldn't sell soy juice. So they called it soy milk. Because anytime you say soy juice, you actually start to gag. And they put soy milk in with my moo cow fuck milk. And it doesn't belong there because we all know there's no soy milk because there's no soy titty, is there?